typical of people with a banner background. Now, when we talk to people in a university or just generally an academic background working in an academic IT department, typically we find a lot of database knowledge. I mean, people are very familiar with databases, but the programming background doesn't tend to fall into an object-oriented category. There's exceptions to that. Mostly at pretty much every school I've talked to, there'll be one or maybe two people who've done some Java or some C++ or maybe one of the .NET languages like C# or VB.NET. But that's about it. They don't tend to have a huge object-oriented background. It tends to be familiarity and maybe working with it a little bit rather than a lot. Also on the issue of web applications, there tends to be some experience with a web application, maybe using PHP or something like that. Sometimes it uses more extensive things like Java web frameworks or servlets and JSPs, but not really that common, not that much. Of course, you have lots and lots of experience with the Banner product, and there's a lot of experience using the various mechanisms inside Banner, like Oracle Forms or other plugins. So before we dig into the meat of it, let's just figure out what some of these terms mean. What are these things all about? First of all, Grails is a framework. That means it's basically a partially constructed web application. It's an app that already exists with the plumbing and the routing and everything already ready to go. You're just supposed to plug in your controllers and your domain model and customize your view the way you want, and Grails will take care of the rest. Now, Grails, as I'll demonstrate for you, has a lot of real convenience features, a lot of mechanisms that make it easy to build a web application very, very quickly. It's relatively new. Grails has only been around for a few years, but it works all the way from the view back to the database and back. And what makes Grails really different from many of the other application frameworks out there is that Grails builds on existing technology. Grails is not trying to, say, reinvent the flat tire, which is what I like to say when people try to reinvent the wheel and they get it wrong. But Grails is based on existing open source, freely available projects that are very popular in the Java industry, things like the Spring Framework and Hibernate. And Grails simply uses the Groovy programming language to customize how those applications work, how those underlying tools work, to make it very easy and effective. Now, this makes Grails a rather interesting blend of old and new. It rests on these older foundations, these very mature technologies, but of course everything has been revised and customized to make it take advantage of as many of the newer developments as possible. It's heavily involved in the term they call convention over configuration. There's not a lot of config files. There's not a ton of XML you have to manipulate or anything to get things to work. Mostly, if you do things the way Grails expects you to do them, then everything works just fine. You don't really have any issues with it at all. If you do things the way Grails doesn't expect, then you have some customization ahead of you and possibly some work there in the code as well. One of the interesting features of Grails from the Banner point of view is that if you use Grails the way it's intended to be used, you should be fine. It should be relatively easy, and especially those people who do not have an extensive object-oriented background, that's probably going to be your life for the first few months or whatever amount of time, your startup time in using the technology, is you'll do things the way Grails prefers them done, and that way you'll still be able to stay relatively productive while you're filling in this additional background, assuming you're interested in doing so. It's an open source technology. Everything can be downloaded for free, including the source code. I've done that on many occasions, and frankly, that's not a bad way to learn some things about it. Not that I dig into the details of the source code itself, but good open source projects tend to be loaded with test cases, and that's in a real way, test cases are like executable documentation for open source. So while the documentation may or may not be great, in some places it's excellent, in some places it's a bit weaker, the test cases will tell you how the technology is intended to be used. So I tend to look for those things and dig into that. But Grails in general, again, if you follow its conventions, is a very easy framework to use, very easy to deploy and work with. basically the deployment story comes down to the same as that for Java. If you've got an application server that supports Java, then you can deploy a Grails app the same way you would deploy any other Java application, and it'll work just fine. I'll talk about that more a little bit later. So again, how can a version 1 product be mature? Grails is currently at version 1.3.5. That's the version I'm going to be using when I do a little demonstrations today. And how can you call something like that mature? Well, again, it's the underlying technologies that are really where the maturity comes from. The Spring framework is a technology in the Java world that is pervasive pretty much throughout the Java industry. It does a lot of what they call dependency injection. It handles the life cycle of objects. I like to call it a Swiss Army chainsaw. It's this massive framework that really touches pretty much every API in the Java world and makes them simpler and easier to use. Hibernate is a technology that is designed to work with databases and to convert database tables into objects and back again. The term ORM there means it's an object relational mapping tool. Turns object-oriented elements like classes and objects into relational tables and back. You have to provide the mapping. You have to tell it how to do this. But once you tell it what the mapping is from your classes to your tables, Hibernate takes care of generating all the SQL and executing it all and opening and closing transactions as required and everything. It's a very powerful technology, very mature. Both Spring and Hibernate are version 3 or above. SiteMesh is an open source technology for handling the view, assembling the view out of various pieces inside of a web page, basically. There's some Ajax libraries that are built in, Prototype, Scriptaculous, a couple others, I think. I think they're moving toward building in jQuery. Any libraries that aren't there, you can easily install through a plug-in mechanism. Quartz is an open source product to allow you to schedule jobs, like cron jobs or whatever, so that things will run on a periodic basis. Again, there's a plug-in for this that works with Grails immediately. Where does Groovy fit in? Groovy, in one sense, is Java. It's not really Java. It's a separate language, but Groovy compiles to Java bytecodes. Java runs by running on what they call a virtual machine, a Java virtual machine, a JVM, that you install on whatever platform you want to use. It could be a workstation, it could be a mainframe, it could be a PC, it could be a Mac, it could be whatever. And that's the heart of this whole write once, run anywhere idea, is that you write your code in Java, you compile it to these bytecodes, whatever the heck a bytecode is, and then run it on the virtual machine. Well, Groovy may be a separate language, but it also compiles to bytecodes that run on the same virtual machine. So anywhere where you have Java installed, Groovy can run as well. Groovy basically takes Java and simplifies it in many ways and enhances it in many other ways. Groovy is a very comfortable language to work with for Java developers. Java developers learn it very rapidly. There's a whole family of new languages that work on the JVM. Groovy's one of them, of course. There's others you may or may not have heard of called, for example, Scala, or Clojure is another one. There's a language called JRuby, which allows you to run Ruby code on the JVM as well. Of all of these languages, Groovy is by far the easiest for Java developers to learn and to use. Now, where does it come into this picture? Well, Groovy is good on its own. I tend to use Groovy a lot on its own for simple scripts or even for fairly extensive programs. But Groovy is also the language that ties all those pieces together in Grails, all those underlying technologies like Spring and Hibernate. Spring and Hibernate are written in Java, and they will always be written in Java. Nobody's going to port Spring to Groovy. You know, it's fine just as it is. Hibernate, of course, I shouldn't be quite so blunt. Hibernate is in Java. There's also an NHibernate version that runs on the .NET framework as well. But what we're dealing with is the Java aspect of it. So those are already in Java, so that means that the Grails framework itself is basically dominated by Java code, but then Groovy is used to tie everything together and to make DSLs. Those are domain-specific languages. One of the ones I'm going to demonstrate for you very briefly is something called GORM, which stands for Grails Object Relational Mapping, or Groovy Object Relational Mapping. I forget which one. Either way, it's a simple way to map your domain classes to database tables. Groovy, as I mentioned, is a programming language. Java has been around now for about 15 years, and that's a fairly long time in the IT world, of course. Groovy is a much newer language and therefore is able to clean up some of the inconsistencies on Java, make some of the Java features a lot easier to use, and also bring in newer developments in the programming language world like closures or builders, etc. We'll see some examples of that pretty shortly. It all works with Java, compiles to the JVM. It is a compiled language. It's much more efficient than an interpreted language, etc. But you can write scripts as well as classes. Again, it's an open source project. All right, how's Banner going to deal with all this? Now, I have talked to many people who work at SunGard. I've talked to people at conferences. I've tried to get involved as much as possible. But let me be blunt right at the beginning. The true answer is we don't know for sure how Groovy and Grails are going to be used inside of Banner. Or maybe some of you do. I certainly don't. What I do know, or at least what I've heard, is that the first Banner module that intends to incorporate Groovy and Grails will be the student module. And they're supposed to announce at the next major SunGard conference when all this is going to happen. But the strongly backed rumor suggests that this new student module will be rolled out probably around the middle of the year, somewhere around June, I believe, is what they're aiming for. Of course, that's all unofficial, but that's the plan. The idea certainly is to be, for Grails rather, to be another replacement for Oracle Forms. I don't believe, by the way, that they're going to remove anything. I don't think that they're going to deprecate any existing applications or make it so you're forced to rewrite anything that already works. And frankly, I always take the philosophy if something already works, I leave it alone. I don't think you need to necessarily port any of your existing applications over to Groovy or to Grails. But if you want to build new applications, then I believe these are going to be options that will be available to you. We don't know exactly what they're going to do, but I know what Groovy does, and I know what Grails does, and therefore we can make some educated guesses as to what their role inside of Banner is going to be. Grails is a pluggable, extensible framework that does much more than web applications, but it's still used by and large for web applications. So chances are, if you're going to be building web applications that take data from an HTML screen and then create domain objects from it and manipulate them and apply business rules, etc., and then send up a result, well, Grails is the technology that is a very natural one for that sort of use case. Groovy itself, of course, appears in Grails, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Banner product will allow you to specify some of your business rules inside Groovy as well. Business rules can be very simple scripts. They can be very powerful applications. That'll be up to you. But I wouldn't be surprised if using Groovy as one of the languages to create your business rules will be supported. I'd be surprised if that was not supported. Maybe I should say it that way. How many double negatives should I throw in here? Let's try it this way. I imagine Banner will support both technologies. So, at any rate, that's where I'm headed with this. One of the things I do want to address is what the learning path would be for people who are Banner developers really heading into Groovy and Grails. I'll get to that a little bit later. How does the Java world see web applications or applications in general? You know, and again, this is for people who have not been in the Java world very much, and you know, their exposure to web applications has been through certain other technologies, somewhat simpler ones like PHP or ASPs or something like that. I don't mean ASP.NET. I mean active server pages in their original form. Well, most Java applications are built around a layered architecture. The idea is that you'll have a presentation layer, which is where you'll take in all your data and when you'll display things to the outside world. And then when you submit data to the application, probably through a form, then that will go to some kind of controller. A controller's job is to possibly validate the input data, but then it's really to play traffic cop, figure out where do you want to go from here. Therefore, controllers don't generally have a lot of the business logic embedded in them, but they instead call classes that do the business logic. These days, that layer tends to go by different names like middleware or business layer or something like that. Nowadays, it tends to be referred to as a service layer. That's where your business logic resides, and that layer is the layer that talks to the persistence layer, which is where your mapping to the database takes place. So if you have a database with lots and lots of tables in it, say there's a table called student or a table called course or a table called instructor, then your persistence layer will be the set of classes whose job it is to turn those tables or table rows into objects and back again. And save a new, say I get a new registration for a student signing up for a course, that registration and the updated course information will be in object form in the persistence layer, and then that layer will save it to a database. The service layer will be there to do transactional stuff as well. It's basically saying if we only had one class and one table, well, life would be very, very simple, right? It's when you introduce relationships that life gets complicated, on many levels, I should say. At any rate, if I was modifying a student table and a course table and, say, a registration table and an instructor table, well, I wouldn't want to start and stop a transaction for each one of those table manipulations. Instead, I'd like to have one transaction that encompasses the entire modification, the entire insert, if you will, or update, as the case may be. And those transactions are managed in the service layer. So the controllers figure out where you want to go, the service layers apply the business logic, and then they work with the persistence layer to save everything in the back end. Pretty much any Java-based framework that you encounter will be designed around this type of architecture. The other term that I used but I didn't really define earlier is the term MVC. That stands for Model View Controller. This is an architecture that's been around with us since, I don't know, the Smalltalk days back in the 60s and 70s, maybe even earlier than that. The idea here is that controllers and views talk to each other. A controller will pass information to the view will submit information to the controller. Both of those will use model objects. The view will access the information out of it. The model will be passed to the view for display. The controllers create model objects and modify them. If any of this stuff is reusable, it's the model. The model doesn't necessarily know anything about the view or the controller. And the views and the controllers tend to be fairly tightly coupled. But everything to accessing the model goes through the view or the controller. You don't access the model directly in any of this. This is a figure that was, I guess the term would be reused from Wikipedia. So let me just start this thing off by building a little Grails application for you and give you an idea what these things look like. So I have here a tool called Spring Source Tool Suite. This is built on an open source editor called Eclipse. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a little Grails application here. So let me say File, New, Grails Project, and I'll call it a quest because if we're going to deal with Grails, we might as well search for the Holy Grails, I suppose. Yeah, that sounds bad. As you can see, running the simple... Yeah, that was really horrible, I understand.
Had to be said.
All I can say is it will get worse before it gets better. As you can see, by running that single command, saying make a Grails application for me, a whole lot of activity suddenly happens. The Grails scripts start right up. They start in a directory. They build an application for me, building a whole bunch of source folders and a folder for controllers and services and domain classes. And I have views with layouts inside them, internationalization, configuration, a whole set of testing directories, including unit testing. And one of the things that's meant by configuration or convention over configuration is that every Grails application created builds an identical structure to it. We'll customize it by adding our own domain classes or controllers or services, but if you encounter a Grails application from someone else that you've never seen, the layout will be exactly the same. You'll just have to go into the appropriate directory and figure out what they did. Then there were a lot of other well, there's a lot of other code generation that went on, and eventually I wound up with what I have in here is a project called Quest. And in here I have a controllers directory and a domain directory, etc. So Grails tends to favor domain-driven design. That means you build your classes representing your domain objects, your student or your course or what have you, and then Grails favors this, and once you have this, then you can start customizing what to do with them and building your business logic and everything. So let me build a new domain class here. So let's see if I click on this. Whoops. Cancel here. Right now the issue I'm having, and it's not really much of an issue, is that I'm running on two different screens. So when I click on a button here, it pops up a window on a different screen. Let me do this a slightly different way. Let me say under Grails Tools to create a domain class this way, and that way I think you can see it right there. So I'll call this com.skillbuilders.quest. And then I want to make a class called a quest here. And again, that triggers a script to start happening. And now we see the code that was generated. I'm hoping this font is big enough. If it turns out this font isn't quite big enough for you to be able to see, please let me know and I'll increase it another size. This is a class that's going to represent my quest. Well, quest should have a name. And there we go. I'll get to this constraints block in a moment, but frankly I already have enough in order to execute my quest, in order to run the project. Run as a Grails application. So let me let that start up. There are three different environments. There's a development environment, there's the testing environment, and there's a production environment. Basically what changes in those cases is which data source you're going to use, and also the ability to reload classes on demand. I now have a URL. This is using an embedded Tomcat server. I didn't have to set that up or anything. It's already built. And when I click on this, you see I have Grails application, available controllers. Oh, I forgot to make a controller. Oh, that's not good. Let's put in a controller. Wait a minute. Under Grails Tools, Create Controller, and I will call this com.skillbuilders.quest again. And that will build a Grails controller. And now I'm going to use one of these really cool built-in capabilities, and that's called scaffolding. This says to Grails, I want you to generate a set of web pages to create and index and update and find quest objects. All I had to do was to run that. This was to create this single line and save it. And now I think I can go back to my web page here and hit refresh. And now there's a controller. And when I click on that link, there I have a web page that says home and new quest, and there's an ID and a name. And if I say I want a new quest, I can put in a name, which is to seek the Grail. And now I've created a quest, and I can edit that and say, nah, let's change that to a lowercase g or something, and go update, and it's there, and I can go to the quest list, and I see there's my quest. And if I make a second quest, which is to learn about Grails, then I can go back to my list here, and I can order them by name by clicking on the name column alphabetically, or reverse order it there, or go back and order them by ID or reverse by ID, whatever you like. And I can even go to the Learn About Grails one and say, nah, let's delete that one. And it'll say, are you sure? And I say, okay. And there you go. I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, that's a lot of code for, or a lot of results for basically putting in one line of code and telling it to use the dynamic scaffolding. All of those web pages are dynamically generated now. This is a really comfortable way to work while your domain model is still changing. Once your domain model settles down, then you can build the static scaffolding. That's the one where you'll see all the code and start making changes to it. I'm going to build this one up a little bit more, but then I'll switch to an application that I've already constructed to show you some of the power that's available in this.
Okay.
So, yes, sir?
Can I ask you a question from Jennifer?
Sure, absolutely.
Where is it currently storing this data?
Good question. Inside the configuration area is a file called datasource.groovy. This is all Groovy code, by the way. And this is showing us that embedded inside of Grails is an HSQL database, hypersonic SQL, or just HSQL as they call it. That is a pure Java file-based database. So it's storing it, actually in this case, it's storing it in a memory version of this. So everything's in memory right now. It's not being saved in a database at all, really, other than this in-memory version, which does support queries and everything. In my more fleshed out application, I'll show you a bigger version that actually uses MySQL for the database, uses MySQL. Changing databases is very simple. You just modify the settings in this file and drop the database driver into the lib directory, and you're all set to go. Were there other questions?
That's it for now, Ken. Thank you.
Okay. By the way, if one of the questions inevitably is, does this work with Oracle? And the answer is absolutely. One of the reasons Grails chose Hibernate is because Hibernate is the leading object relational mapping tool in the Java industry, and basically it can work with pretty much any database in existence. I have to caveat that by saying I'm talking about relational databases here. If you want to work with the so-called NoSQL databases, the non-relational types like CouchDB or MongoDB or some of the others, there actually are plugins that lets Grails work with those too, but that's not going through Hibernate. All right, so much for our quest. You know, quests really need they need tasks to do. Oh, before I do that, actually, let's take a look. If I make a new quest and say I forget to put in my name and I just click create, then it says, sure, I'm more than happy to create a quest with no name. And there it is. And notice, by the way, it's got this ID auto-generated as a primary key for the quest table, which is an auto-increment right now. This, again, can be customized however you want. But I don't really want there to be quests without any names to them. That doesn't make any sense. So this is where the constraints block comes in. In the constraints block, I go, all right, by the way, name should be blank is false. Now, this is Groovy code because really what I'm doing is saying that name is a function. Name's a method. It's short for, I could put in parentheses like this and say I'm using name as an operation, and the argument is that the blank property of name should be false. The parentheses are optional inside of Groovy. Now when I save that, it tries to refresh everything, and sometimes that works and sometimes it does not. You saw that by adding a controller worked just fine, but when you change the domain model, most of the time I have to restart the application. Let me give it a try anyway. I'll put in a new quest. See, it wasn't happy with that. So let me go in here to my Grails app, and I will stop the Grails application, and then let me restart it. Run app for the quest here. Again, this is unfortunately happening on my other screen. I'm not able to drag it over, but it's just a shortcut way to start up the application. Since this is using an in-memory database while we're in development mode at the moment, I'm going to lose all of the data that I've already put in. There's a way to pre-configure the data, and there's also a way, of course, to make sure you don't lose the data. Let me close that existing window and then open up the new one and go to my quest controller. And now if I try to make a new quest without a name, I get the field highlighted in red, and it says property name of class com.skillbuilders.quest.quest cannot be blank. First of all, hey, that's pretty cool. You know, I'm glad that it was able to give me that information, but that's not a very good error message. The error messages are all built in to Grails, and there's a directory here called I18N, which stands for internationalization. Do you know why it stands for internationalization, by the way? Do you know that? Gary, you know that, don't you?
You're asking the wrong person, Ken. And I didn't see the other presentation, so I can't answer.
the reason it stands for internationalization is because the word internationalization, if you're going to write it down, you'd write an I, and then there'd be 18 letters, and then an N, believe it or not.
Ken, I would have known that because somebody just chatted it in. Number of letters between I and N. So
I gave you a chance, man. I really did.
I know what. I didn't see the question. I didn't see Jennifer's response. So.
Yeah, we'll see that you should be watching there. Well, never mind. Let's go on. At any rate, this internationalization is basically designed into Java from the beginning, and the idea is to have a file full of keys and values. And then what happens is in your display, you refer to a key, and what you get back is a value. Well, that error message that we just saw here, property name of class whatever cannot be blank, is the default blank message. See here, it says default blank message. Property 0 of class 1 cannot be blank. So, of course, I want to change that. Now, I've got to be very careful here. I've got to get the message right. So let me go back to my browser. That's not the one I wanted, that one. And let me go to the Grails website. Here's grails.org. And I'll go to the documentation. And there is a user guide, which is incredibly helpful. This is the fundamental user's guide for Grails with all the up-to-date information. And if I look along the side here, past the command line constraints, there's the blank constraint. And it says set to false if a string cannot be blank. Error code is classname.propertyname.blank. So in other words, I should go back to my file here, and my class name is com.skillbuilders.quest.quest. Property name is name.blank. And I'll set my message to be Quest must have a name. And I'll save that. And now I'll go back to the Create Quest page and just refresh. Actually, see, it just picked up the change and refreshed here. And now if I call Create again, I get Quest must have a name. And again, I mean, very little work on my part, and I wound up with this nice behavior. Now let me make another modification to the domain model. This time, I'm going to say Quest not only have a name, but quests also have tasks to do. So let's see, create domain class, which I'll call com.skillbuilders.quest.task. Once again, the script is running. Here's my task. Let me add in some fields. Task will also have a name, and task, let's say, can have a difficulty, which I'll say is an integer. And tasks will have a start date and an end date. How's that sound? Let me save myself a step here and say that the name can't be blank. I have to have that. The difficulty, and now let me use one of those other constraints. So one of the other constraints was in list, for example. No, that's not the one I want. How about range? Yeah, that looks good. I'll say the range is between 1 and 5. And then I want the start date to appear before the end date. But for the end date, I have to put in a custom validator, which, let's see, this is val and task. And I want to say that the value has to be greater than or equal to task.startDate. That's all Groovy code as a way of saying that the end date should appear after the start date. Now that I've done that, let me make a controller for it as well, so I can scaffold that also. Grails tools, create controller. I wonder if I can browse to the domain class. Yeah, that's a nice convenience. This SpringSource Tool Suite editor has got about the best Grails support of any tool I know. Okay, so let's scaffold that one. Save. And then I know that I'm going to need to restart. Yeah, cannot generate controller class. It's just going to be confused. It's too much to ask it to keep updating automatically. So I'll do that, and then I'll restart the program. Restart or run app quest. Where's my web page? Let me close that. I knew that was here. It came up on the other screen. That's what it's waiting for me to hit return on the other screen. There we go. So that ought to start up the application again. And now I can look and see that I have, whoops, what happened to the task controller? Refresh. Ah, there it is. There's the task controller. Browser caching, huh? Isn't it great? So here I could put in quests if I wanted to, but I could also put in tasks as well. You see that it's already got name, difficulty, start date, and end date. And if I say new task, you see that I've got a drop-down list for the difficulty, for my range, and I've got this nice little field generator for the start and end dates, which started with today, and the end date had to be at today. So let me violate some constraints to see what that would look like. I'll say the end date was yesterday. The difficulty, I can't do anything about that. That's already set up. And if I just say create, then what it's going to tell me is property end date of task with value, whatever, does not pass custom validation. In other words, it wasn't after the start date. And then the name also can't be blank. Let me make one other modification now. Stop the server. Let me go back to the quest here. And now I'm going to say that, and this is where the GORM stuff comes in. Quests has many tasks, type task. This is building a one-to-many relationship between the quest table and the task table. I'll also say that for the tasks, that a task belongs to a quest. And that's going to give me a cascade delete relationship. In other words, when I delete a quest, it will also delete all the associated tasks as well. If I left out the belongs to, I would still get a cascade save, for the inserts, and a cascade update, but I wouldn't get a cascade delete. Whether you want a cascade delete or not depends on your application. You'd have to decide. So now when I go into the quest controller and say, yeah, I'm going to seek the Grail, then I can go and say edit it, and notice it'll say, oh, you want to add a task? And I do. So that will say, oh, well, what's the task? And I'll say, run away from Killer Rabbit. That's an easy one. It's for the first quest, and I'll say create on that. And let me make another task, which will be defeat the Black Knight. I'm invincible. You're a loony. Cut your arms off. It's just a flesh wound. One more task here. Answer the bridge keeper. What is your name? What is your quest? There we go. And now if I look at my task list, you can see all the tasks have been created. They all have the start and end dates. They all are associated with a quest. We've got their degree of difficulty, which I can sort on like that. I can sort on the IDs, of course. From the quest, or from the task rather, I can go back to the quest, and the quest shows all the tasks in there. Now I'm not getting a very nice picture here, but I can change that too. I can say, if you're a Java developer, you'd be familiar with the term the toString method, which basically says, how do I convert an object into a string? And let's do that for the quest and then for the task. I'll say, let's see, we'll put in the name and the difficulty, and that'll be enough. Save. And then let's see if I get lucky. Oops, didn't mean to go to the Grails website. I meant to go home. Now that's changing the domain objects, as I say, tends to be a bit of an issue. And that's as far as I will go with this before I talk to you about some other topics and then the bigger application, which I'll just illustrate for you very quickly. So let's see. So it's running here. And now I can go to my quest. And here's my quest controller. And again, I lost my data, but I'll show you how that's fixed. Seek the Grail. And now when I say I want to add a task, you'll see that now Seek the Grail, there's my toString method showing me what I'm dealing with. And let's see, what should my task be this time? It's, get taunted by Frenchmen. That was that night, Go away or I shall taunt you a second time.
I did a question to the audience on who's understanding the Monty Python references. Few people are getting that.
Well, the Python, especially if you're a Python developer, they're getting all of my. If you're not at least familiar with, but if you're not at least familiar with Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you're not really a developer. I'm sorry, I just have to go there.
I have to say the truth. When you said kill a rabbit, I didn't get it. When you said the Black Knight, it all came back to me.
Okay, well, let me stop the application at this point. That was interesting. That's some pretty good stuff. And let me go to the other application that I have that is much more fleshed out and not quite as silly either. So let me run this application, which will be the one in registration this time. And while that's starting up, let me show you a somewhat more sophisticated domain model. So in this case, I'm going to have a course, and a course has a course number and a name and a number of credits, and there's my constraints on it. I put in a matching constraint to say that the course name has to have one or more capital letters followed by one or more numbers. The name can't be blank. That's the course number, sorry. You can have a maximum of 10 sections between 1 and 5 credits, say. I initialize the credits to 3. Here is a section of a course that has a number and what days they meet. Down here I specify the meeting days are either Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, or one day a week, basically. The numbers in the range of 1 to 10. I have a start time and an end time and an instructor, and the max number of students here is 20. Then I also have an instructor as a salutation, which is professor, doctor, Mr., Ms., or nothing, and a last name, which is required. And then I'll say that we have student. The student has an ID, first name, last name, email address, a location, and an advisor, because we're going to do distance ed here, just like our nice little getting started with Groovy and Grails class in January at Skillbuilders. At any rate, students have many sections. They belong to it. Well, actually, it's a has-many relationship in both directions. It's a many-to-many relationship, that students are in many sections and sections have many students. There's my constraints. And finally, the location here is a street, city, state with a latitude and longitude. And I'm going to compute the latitude and longitude from a plugin. So this guy is now running. And by the way, I have a class here called Bootstrap, which lets me fill in some original data. So I'm going to have an instructor called Mr. Slate and a section for two sections of Groovy and one of Grails, and there's my courses and my Grails courses and my students and the locations and everything. Here's the bottom line. Let me go to the course controller, and this is using a MySQL database, by the way. And there's a course number and the name and the credits, and if I click on a course like Grails, you'll see that a course actually has, this one has a prereq, which is another course called Groovy. There's only one section there. If I go to the Groovy class, that has a couple sections, and if I click on a section, you'll see that I've got a student in there, Fred's in there, and there we have his email address and everything and where he's located. And let me go to the student list, and here's where the cool part will happen. This is using an embedded Google map to show where all the students are located. I put everybody in the Portsmouth area because that's where the conference was. But if I want to add another student now, then I'll say, I don't know what the ID is Actually, didn't I have to, what was the, where's Fred here? Oh, the student ID had to start with letters, didn't it? Yeah, that's right. So I'm making it up. I'll probably make that generated. 86 will be Maxwell Smart Max at control dot. You think that's no, that's gov, right? That's a government operation. We'll let Mr. Slapey, his advisor. I don't know where that's located, but I'll just put him. Let's see, what's close to Norfolk? Virginia Beach, Virginia, and create. And what's the problem? Oh, 4 digits. Yeah, 4 digits. 8699. Create, and now I can go back to my student list, and there's Max out in Virginia Beach. Building this application took me, yes, sir.
Someone's asking if they'll be able to download the registration source code.
For a small fee, no. Sure, I'll export the whole. Now I have to warn you though. Grails is a plugin-based architecture, and therefore, when you deploy this thing, you get a lot of jar files. You know, a lot of Groovy, the Hibernate jars and the Spring jars. And I'm using plugins here as well, so there's a fair amount of source code involved. Or actually, it's not a lot of source; there's a lot of plugins. What I can make available is the source, the stuff that I wrote. If you want the full application as a WAR file, then that's probably around 30 megs or something like that in size. These days, that's not really all that huge, but that would take a significant download. I'll tell you what, I'll export that, and in order to run this on your own system, you'd have to set up the database. You don't have to generate the tables. As a matter of fact, one of the things I wanted to show you real quick is that here is MySQL Workbench. These are the tables that were generated from the domain model I made. You see, a course has this course_course business is the prereq business. That's the dependency for that. Courses have many sections. There's my many-to-many relationship between sections and students. This is the link table, combining the two. The instructor table also, a section has an instructor has many students going that way, and students all have locations. So again, this was all auto-generated. But so that was the long answer. The short answer is, sure, you can have all this code. I don't care.
Okay.
It's all basically working. Pardon me?
One more quick question, Ken.
Yeah.
Can you make the error messages more friendly, ergo where the ID had to be the length of 4?
Absolutely. And all I have to do is go to that same I18N file and figure out what field generates that error message, which again is easy. I know what's generating it. It's the one here, student. It's the one with the student ID, and see what a matches constraint gives me as a key, and then on that key I would plug in student IDs must have 2 capital letters followed by 4 decimal digits, something like that. No problem.
Great. Okay.
Anything else?
That's it for now. Thank you.
All right, well, with that in mind, now let me go back to the slides, and this way I'll be able to show you that we've really covered almost everything at this point. The persistence business. Grails comes with this HSQL database, uses an in-memory version, so there was 0 configuration. I didn't do anything, but I can add code to the Bootstrap for startup, and I can switch to databases, pretty much anything you want. That business with the has many and the belongs to, setting up the relationships, that's part of Grails Object Relational Mapping, or GORM. It's all based on Hibernate 3. Whatever the version is. You could put in your Hibernate properties. You could do one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many. You can even build custom mappings for existing databases if you already have a database, which pretty much everybody does. What was that about mapping to existing databases? Well, if you already have an Oracle database, then Grails can map to it as long as Hibernate can understand it, Grails can understand it. And Hibernate can understand a lot. Life is extremely simple if your tables have a primary key called ID of type integer. If not, if you've got an ID of a primary key called something else, that's easy to fix. If you've got a compound primary key, they can handle that too. I've mapped to those before. It messes up the scaffolding, but the main model works just fine. You just have to write your own view layers. Foreign keys are all in the form of other table underscore ID. They all put in a version column in the table for what they call optimistic locking, so that two people trying to change the same table don't overwrite each other's changes. If we had more time, I'd go into that in detail, but it's a very powerful notion and a very efficient way of doing things because it doesn't actually lock any rows. Existing databases, that's those requirements, that's a lot of requirements. So you can do things like composite keys or alternate table or column names or types. You can put in your own special join tables. GORM can map pretty much anything, but there may be some work involved. In the course that we run, we'll definitely take some time to do that. We'll map to, what I like to map to just as a sample database is that MySQL has a sample database they call Sequila. That's the name of that dolphin symbol, for MySQL. But basically it has films and actors and stores and everything, and we map to that existing database rather. This is really what it looks like. You put in a static mapping block and say, hey, the person class has a table named people, and the first name column is first underscore name, etc. You just work your way out that way. Actually, this one isn't even necessary. Grails is smart enough to realize that if it's camel case in Groovy, it's underscores in the database. It'll figure that out on its own. I showed you some of the validation steps with blank or range. There's ones like email and credit card, which do a regular expression match from the Apache custom validators from there. It's an open source validator. You can check on uniqueness. You can put things in a list. There's a whole bunch of different validators. You also get these dynamic finders. In other words, all I have to do is build the domain model, and then I can write. I don't have to implement any of these queries. These queries are already available. So say I have a book class. This is taken right out of the Grails documentation, and it has titles and release dates. Well, I automatically can say book find by title. GINA stands for Groovy in Action. One of my favorite books ever. I've spent many a pleasant evening with GINA. Or I could say find by title like Groovy, where's my like clause there, or release date between a start and an end, or find by title like and release date greater than, and I didn't have to write any of that. That's already provided by Grails. I actually used that relatively recently. I was looking up all courses that I had taught in a given month, and when I wound up writing the query, all I said was course.find by start date before and release an end date after, and then put in the arguments, and it all came out just fine. I didn't get to show it, but services are these things that are used across multiple controllers and have the business logic in them and have those declarative transactions. I did actually use one in the registration service. It was the latitude-longitude lookup that used Google's geocoder. If I had more time, I'd show it to you, but you can see it in the source code under the services here. There's a services domain. Here's my geocoder service, and there's no key involved or anything. This all goes to Google's geocoder and builds a URL and gets back XML and parses the XML and extracts the information right at it into doubles. And in about 10 lines of Groovy code, I can do that entire process. Very nice. The view layer is built in what they call Groovy server pages that look like JSPs, but they understand Groovy, and they have lots of good libraries available. You can build your own custom tag libraries. There are hundreds of plugins available. For this one, I happen to use a plugin called Rich UI, which is what included the Google Map. I think I also used a plugin to put in an actual calendar widget rather than the drop-downs for the calendar for the dates and times. So there are tons of plugins. Some of them are good, some of them are not so great. I mean, they're early. A lot of them are very early in their development. Spring Security, for example, or Apache Shiro is another security example. Searchable is very great. You add that in one line, you can search your whole domain model. CAPTCHAs and reCAPTCHAs, sending off email, the court scheduling, generating RSS or Atom feeds, charting, web testing, everything. Really good. How do I deploy it? I just run Grails war. I get a war file. I drop it in Tomcat, and I'm running. That's all there is to it. It's very easy. The war file is fairly large because of all the libraries, but it still runs. Lots of testing available. I have test cases in my registration app, which you can have. It's all built in there. All right, so last thing I want to address here is what do you need to know in order to use this stuff? Well, Grails is a combination of Groovy and Spring and Hibernate, although the Spring and Hibernate stuff very well hidden. You will eventually need to understand something about Spring and Hibernate, but you don't really need to know it right away. You're using it, and the more you know about it later, the better off you'll be, but you don't have to know it to get started. Grails is primarily for web apps, and Groovy's based on Java. So if you're already a Java developer, hey, life is simple. You pick up some Groovy, you go into Grails, and you're ready to go. So what happens if you're not an object-oriented developer? So as I said before, Grails hides enough details, so if you do things the Grail wants you to do them, you can stay productive while learning these other things. And what about the long term? Well, if you want to do Grails well, you need to learn Groovy and understand something about web apps. That's easy. Be able to work with Java libraries, that's getting familiar with them, and get familiar with how Spring and Hibernate works. So existing Java developers have an easy path, relatively speaking. But what about Java, non-Java people? Well, you really do need to become comfortable with Java. That transition to object-oriented programming can be difficult or time-consuming for some people just because it is a conceptual change. It is a different feel for things. That's where the hard part's going to be for most people. If you have any object-oriented background at all, though, then that will be a much easier transition for you. And, of course, we have classes and all these things, as you might imagine. Here's some resources. There's the home page for Grails, the reference guide. The Groovy and Grails communities are extremely friendly and welcoming to newcomers, and I participate on the email list there. There's a user list and developer list. Most of the core Groovy and Grails members are on Twitter. Here's some books on this. The Definitive Guide to Grails, of course, is definitive. And the one that's the real friendly one, this one by Dave Klein called Grails, a Quick Start Guide, will take you and not assume you know anything, will have you up and running very nicely. It's a very friendly book. It just doesn't have all the answers, but it's a very easy one to read. Dave Klein's a good friend, and he's a very nice guy. I recommend it. This Getting Started with Grails is actually a free download. If you go to InfoQ and you search on this, you have to register, but you can download this book and just start reading it in a PDF form. I have to mention, of course, Manning has a Grails in Action book, which is also excellent. Glenn Smith and Peter Ledbrook wrote that. And I think that's it. So I did go a little bit over, but I will be happy to hang out for a few minutes and answer questions that you might have. As I mentioned, these slides will all be available to you as soon as possible, and I'll also make sure that you can have that registration code. So if there's anything else, as I say, I'll be happy to hang around, but that's the stuff I wanted to get through during the webinar.